The diner smelled like burnt coffee and old grease, and Sarah couldn't stop staring at the crack that ran diagonally across their laminate table. This wasn't what she'd imagined when Marcus had asked her to dinner after 3 months of crossing paths at Valley Creek Community Church, where they both volunteered with the youth group. She'd pictured candles maybe, white tablecloths, somewhere her mother would approve of, somewhere that matched the butterflies that had taken residence in her stomach. Every time Marcus smiled at her with those warm brown eyes that seemed to see straight through to the parts of herself she kept hidden. But here they were at Joe's Diner on the forgotten edge of Columbus, Ohio, where the vinyl booths were patched with duct tape and the fluorescent lights hummed with a persistence that made her head ache. Sarah smoothed down her dress, the navy blue one she'd spent 2 hours choosing, and tried not to think about how overdressed she looked next to the truckers hunched over their plates at the counter. Marcus sat across from her in jeans and a simple button-down, completely at ease, as if this place held no shame for him whatsoever. She wanted to ask why he'd brought her here, but the words caught in her throat because she'd been raised to be polite, to smile through disappointment, to never make anyone feel small. The waitress appeared with menus that stuck together from syrup residue, and Sarah noticed the woman's tired eyes, the way her hand trembled slightly as she poured water into their scratched glasses. Marcus thanked her by name, asking about her son's recovery from surgery, and the woman's whole face transformed as she talked about little Danny coming home from the hospital. Sarah watched this exchange with growing confusion because Marcus listened like he genuinely cared, like this stranger's story mattered as much as anything else in the world. After the waitress left, Sarah finally found her voice. "You come here often?" She tried to keep the judgment from her tone, but wasn't sure she succeeded. Marcus leaned back, that easy smile playing at his lips. "Every Friday for the past 8 years, since I moved to Columbus for work." He paused, studying her face. "I know this isn't what you expected, Sarah. I could see it in your eyes the moment we walked in, and I almost took you somewhere else, somewhere I thought would impress you. But then I realized that if we're going to do this, if we're going to see where this connection between us leads, I need you to see the real me first. Not the version of me that performs on Sunday mornings or the one who leads Bible studies in pressed khakis." Sarah's fingers wrapped around her water glass, condensation cool against her palm. "I don't understand. My father left when I was 7, Marcus said quietly, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made it impossible to look away. "Left my mom with 3 kids and enough debt to drown in. We lost our house, moved into a shelter for a while, then a tiny apartment where I shared a room with my 2 brothers. My mom worked 3 jobs just to keep us fed and clothed. And on Friday nights, when she finally got a few hours off, she'd take us to a diner just like this one. And we'd split pancakes and hot chocolate. And for those moments, we weren't poor. We were just a family sitting together, grateful for what we had." Sarah felt something crack open in her chest, shame flooding through her for every judgmental thought she'd had since walking through that door. "Marcus, wait," he said gently. "Let me finish. That waitress, Linda, her husband died 2 years ago. Cancer. Left her with medical bills that would break most people. She works double shifts here, and every Friday I come in because someone needs to remind her that she's seen, that her struggle matters, that she's not alone. The cook back there, Eddie? He's been sober for 6 months after losing everything to addiction. Joe gave him a job when no one else would. The dishwasher is a kid from the youth center trying to save money for community college. This place, Sarah, this place that probably looks like failure to you, is actually where I see Jesus most clearly. Not in stained glass and polished pews, but here, in the broken and the struggling and the ones who keep showing up anyway." The tears came before Sarah could stop them, sliding hot down her cheeks as she realized how much she'd missed the point of everything. She'd grown up comfortable in suburban Cincinnati, gone to a private Christian school, dated boys who took her to nice restaurants, where the correct fork mattered more than the conversation. She'd thought faith was about having the right answers, attending the right church, maintaining the right appearance. But Marcus was showing her something different, something that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I was so focused on what this place looked like that I couldn't see what it actually was." Marcus reached across the table, his hand covering hers. "Don't apologize. I'm asking you to see the world differently than you were taught. That's not easy, but Sarah, if we're going to build something together, I need to know that you can see beyond surfaces. I need to know that when life gets hard, when the money's tight or the future's uncertain, you will remember that our worth isn't measured in restaurant choices or Pinterest perfect moments. It's measured in how we love people, especially the ones the world overlooks." Linda returned to take their order, and Sarah asked her about Danny. Really asked, really listened to the story of a single mother's fear and relief, and the community that had rallied around her. She learned that the church ladies had brought meals for 2 weeks, that Marcus had driven Linda to the hospital every day because her car had broken down, that Danny was 7 years old and obsessed with dinosaurs and wanted to be a paleontologist when he grew up. When Linda walked away, Marcus ordered the meatloaf special, and Sarah ordered the same, and they talked for 3 hours about things that mattered. He told her about growing up poor, about the shame of free lunch tickets and shoes from Goodwill, about the youth pastor who'd seen something in him and helped him apply for scholarships, about working his way through Ohio State while his brothers did the same. He told her about his mother's unwavering faith, how she'd pray over their apartment every morning, thanking God for what they had instead of lamenting what they'd lost. He told her about the moment he dedicated his life to living differently, to building wealth not for comfort but for the purpose of lifting others up, to never forgetting where he came from or the people still fighting their way out. Sarah shared her own story, the one she'd never quite told anyone because it didn't fit the narrative of her perfect suburban upbringing. She talked about her parents' bitter divorce when she was 15, hidden behind smiles and church attendance, about her mother's depression, and her father's new family that replaced them so easily, about feeling like a fraud every time she posted carefully curated photos on social media that suggested a life much happier than the reality. She talked about choosing her college major based on what would make her marketable for marriage rather than what made her heart sing, about the emptiness of checking all the right boxes while feeling increasingly disconnected from anything real. "I've been performing," she admitted, the words tasting like truth and relief. "Performing the good Christian girl, the potential wife, the successful professional. But I don't know who I actually am underneath all that." Marcus's eyes never left her face. "Then maybe it's time to find out. And maybe, if you'll let me, I can walk that journey with you. Not as someone who has it all figured out, because God knows I don't, but as someone who's learned that real faith happens in the mess, in the questions, in the moments when we're brave enough to be honest about our brokenness." They stayed until the diner closed, until Linda was wiping down tables and Eddie was shutting down the kitchen, and when they finally stepped out into the cool Ohio night, Sarah felt different somehow, like she'd shed a skin she'd been wearing too long. Marcus walked her to her car, their fingers intertwined, and she thought about how wrong she'd been about everything, about what mattered and what didn't, about what kind of man she needed and what kind of life she actually wanted. "Can I see you again?" Marcus asked, though his smile suggested he already knew the answer. "Every Friday," Sarah said. "I want to come here every Friday with you. I want to know Linda's story and Eddie's story and everyone else's story. I want to learn how to see people the way you do." That was 8 months ago, and Sarah could hardly believe how much had changed. She'd quit her corporate marketing job that had paid well but hollowed her out, started working at a nonprofit that served homeless families, taken a massive pay cut that somehow felt like freedom. She'd started attending a small church on the east side of Columbus instead of the megachurch, where appearance mattered more than authenticity. She'd stopped posting on social media entirely, stopped performing her life for an audience that didn't actually know her. She'd started journaling, praying differently, asking God harder questions, and being okay with complicated answers. And every Friday, she and Marcus went to Joe's Diner, and every Friday, Sarah learned more about what love actually looked like when it was lived instead of theorized. She learned that Linda's son was thriving, that Eddie had been promoted to head cook, that the dishwasher had gotten a full scholarship to Columbus State. She learned that Marcus quietly paid for people's meals when they were short on cash, that he'd helped Linda fix her car, that he'd spent his Saturdays mentoring at-risk kids through the youth center. But tonight was different, because when they walked into the diner, it was packed with people Sarah recognized from church, from the youth center, from the nonprofit where she worked. Linda stood behind the counter beaming, and Eddie had come out of the kitchen, and even Joe himself was there, which never happened on a Friday night. Sarah looked at Marcus in confusion, but he just squeezed her hand and led her to their usual booth. "I don't understand," Sarah said as everyone watched them with knowing smiles. Marcus slid into the booth across from her, but instead of sitting, he moved back out and dropped to one knee on the worn linoleum floor. Sarah's heart stopped, her hand flying to her mouth as she realized what was happening. "Sarah Elizabeth Parker," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "8 months ago I brought you to this diner because I needed you to see my heart before you saw anything else. I needed you to understand that I don't measure life in Instagram moments or impressive dates. I measure it in people loved, in prayers answered, in showing up when it's hard, in choosing faith over fear every single day. And Sarah, you didn't just pass the test. You transformed. You became someone who sees what I see, who loves how I love, who understands that following Jesus means getting our hands dirty and our hearts broken and our lives wonderfully, beautifully complicated by caring about people the world overlooks." Tears streamed down Sarah's face as Linda and Eddie and everyone else pressed closer, phones out to capture the moment. "I want to build a life with you," Marcus continued, pulling a simple ring from his pocket, a ring Sarah could tell wasn't expensive, but was chosen with care. "I want to keep coming to this diner every Friday for the next 50 years. I want to raise kids who know that their worth isn't in what they have, but in how they love. I want to wake up every morning next to someone who challenges me to be better, to see clearer, to love deeper. I want to serve God together, to mess up together, to learn together, to build something that matters more than comfort or status or any of the things the world tells us to chase." He opened the box, and the ring caught the fluorescent light, simple and perfect. "Will you marry me, Sarah? Will you choose this life with me, this messy, beautiful, purpose-driven life where we measure wealth and impact instead of income, where we invest in people instead of appearances, where we trust that God's vision for us is so much bigger than anything we could plan for ourselves?" Sarah couldn't speak through the sobs, so she just nodded frantically, pulling Marcus up and into her arms as the diner erupted in cheers and applause. He slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, just like everything else about this moment, about this man, about this completely unexpected journey her life had taken. Linda brought out a cake she'd hidden in the back, and Eddie started playing music from a speaker, and for the next 2 hours, Joe's diner became the site of the most joyful celebration Sarah had ever experienced. People shared stories about Marcus, about his generosity and faithfulness, about how he'd changed their lives by simply seeing them, valuing them, showing up for them. Linda talked about how Marcus had not only helped with her car, but had anonymously paid off a chunk of her medical debt. Eddie shared that Marcus had attended every single one of his AA meetings for 6 months, never missing one, being the accountability partner that had saved his life. The dishwasher, now a college student, revealed that Marcus had been supplementing his scholarship with his own money, making it possible for him to focus on studies instead of working full-time. Sarah listened to these stories, her hand in Marcus's, and realized that she hadn't just found a husband. She'd found her calling. She'd found the life she was supposed to live, the person she was supposed to become. She thought about the girl who'd walked into this diner 8 months ago, judging it by its cracked tables and worn floors, and she wanted to hug that girl and tell her that sometimes God's greatest gifts come wrapped in the most unexpected packages. Later, as they sat alone in their booth after everyone had left, Sarah looked at her ring and then at Marcus. "I need to tell you something," she said. "I want our wedding to be here. Not at some fancy venue, not at the big church. Here, in this diner. With Linda and Eddie and Joe and everyone who's shown me what real community looks like. I want our wedding to be about what matters, about the people who've taught us how to love better." Marcus's eyes filled with tears as he pulled her close. "Have I told you lately that you're the answer to prayers I didn't even know how to pray?" They sat there in the quiet diner, in the place that had tested and transformed and ultimately united them, and Sarah sent up a prayer of gratitude for the journey that had brought her here. She thanked God for the disappointment that had become revelation, for the judgment that had become humility, for the performance that had become authenticity. She thanked him for a man who'd had the courage to show her his real life instead of an impressive facade, for a community that had welcomed her into their struggles and victories, for the chance to build something meaningful instead of just comfortable. She thought about the wedding they'd plan, about the life they'd build, about the children they'd raised to understand that following Jesus meant loving radically, giving generously, and showing up consistently for the people others overlooked. She thought about the Friday nights they'd spend in this diner for decades to come, investing in people's lives, celebrating their victories, mourning their losses, being the kind of presence that reminded everyone that they mattered, that they were seen, that they were loved. And as Marcus walked her to her car that night, as he kissed her under the flickering streetlight in the diner's parking lot, Sarah understood something profound. She'd spent her whole life waiting for a fairy tale, for a prince to sweep her into a perfect story. But Marcus had offered her something better. He'd offered her a real story, a messy story, a story that would require sacrifice and courage and constant choice. A story where the magic wasn't in grand gestures but in daily faithfulness, where the romance wasn't in expensive dates but in seeing and being seen, where the happy ending wasn't guaranteed but had to be built brick by brick through commitment and grace and unwavering faith. 3 months later, they were married in Joe's diner on a Saturday afternoon, surrounded by 70 people who'd become family. Linda was Sarah's matron of honor, and the dishwasher-turned-student was Marcus's best man. They exchanged vows they'd written themselves, promising to always choose purpose over comfort, to measure success in lives changed, rather than bank accounts filled, to build their marriage on the foundation of serving others, and following Jesus into the hard places where love was most needed. Their story spread through Columbus, then beyond, as people shared videos of the diner wedding, where the groom had proposed months earlier in the same spot. News outlets picked it up, calling it heartwarming and unexpected, but to Sarah and Marcus, it was simply the most honest thing they could have done. It was a declaration that their marriage would be built on the same values that had brought them together, that they would continue to show up at Joe's diner every Friday, that they would keep investing in people who needed to know they mattered. And they did. For years and eventually decades, they came to Joe's diner every Friday, and their children came with them, learning to see the world through eyes of compassion and purpose. Those children grew up understanding that wealth meant having enough to share, that status meant using influence to lift others, that success meant being faithful to what God called them to do regardless of what the world applauded. They learned these lessons not from sermons, but from watching their parents live them, from knowing Linda and Eddie and Joe as extended family, from understanding that their own lives were meant to be poured out in service rather than hoarded in comfort. Sarah often thought about that first date, about the girl who'd walked into the diner with judgment in her heart and walked out with her eyes open to a completely different way of living. She thought about how close she'd come to missing it all, to choosing comfort over calling, to settling for a life that looked good on the surface but was empty underneath. And she thanked God for Marcus, for his courage in showing her the truth of his life before the polish, for trusting that she could handle reality and rise to meet it. The story of their first date became legend in their community, A reminder that sometimes the greatest love stories begin in the most unexpected places, that sometimes what looks like disappointment is actually divine appointment, that sometimes the cheap diner holds more truth than the fancy restaurant ever could. It became a story their friends told at dinner parties, that their children told their own children, a story about choosing what matters and having the courage to build a life on faith rather than fear. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.